third and last video recorded in a row. Let's go. Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is Chaotic Bibliophile, and today I bring you my March wrap-up part 1. If you're wondering why in God's name I would record a 2-part March wrap-up, it's because I don't have it in me to edit long videos anymore. So I hope you enjoy this anyway. March was wonderful, but it was also so hectic. Even so, I managed to read a lot, not only because I just was in the mood for reading a lot, but also because I had to read a lot of things for uni. And looking at that stack, I decided I would separate them into novels and nonfiction and sort of the straight up prose writing. Do I have any poetry? I don't think so. Anyways, that and unusual books, because one of the modules that I did this term was experiments in form, and I read a lot of experimental literature. Some of it actually is in the other wrap-up, ironically. I basically want to tell you about one unusual book that I read, and then one that I didn't read cover to cover, but I still want to show you, and graphic novels. Let's go to the books. The first book, the one that I didn't read cover to cover, but I still wanted to show you just so you can see it, is A Hummument, a treated Victorian novel by Tom Phillips. This is an art book that has a lie on the cover. It says final edition. It is not the final edition. I mean, I guess printed, yes, but the artist has continued to work and do the art that he does with the novel. So the whole story of this book is that Tom Phillips found this Victorian novel called A Human Document, and that is why it's called A Hummument, because, you know, it cut certain parts. And yeah, and what he does is he paints over them and creates a text. Supposedly there is a narrative here. There are like 2 characters and it's a bit of a love story. I didn't read the whole thing. I made the point that this reads almost as poetry, and you can read each page as a poem, and sort of the relation with image and text works very well like that. But I had classmates that did read the whole thing and read it as a novel. The other thing is that the first edition is completely different to this one, and in between there have been changes, but I've seen, and you can Google this and see it online. I will link it down below actually, so you can check it out for yourselves. You can see 3 main transformations of most of the pages. And so if you compared aesthetically the first version versus the last edition, the first one is much less sophisticated. These are way more beautiful. But then narratively, the others make so much sense. And for example, a classmate made this point of, oh, and it gets a bit sexy and funny, and he read a page. I was looking at the same page in my edition, and I just said, what the hell are you talking about? This is a completely different page. Of course, in his edition, which was the first one, that's what it was. And in my edition, that was lost. So I think it got more towards the visual than the narrative. I could be wrong. That's just my impression. So yeah, I didn't read this cover to cover, and I didn't count it in my Storygraph challenge or anything. I just really wanted to show you because it just is such an interesting book. I have not made up my mind whether I'm going to keep this or not. I do think it's a good book sort of to just open it, grab a page and read it and experience that. So I might read it for the funsies, or maybe I do like a page a day. I'll think about it. Also, one thing of the final edition is that it has these vignettes, more organized, more graphic in the graphic novel sense, in the design sense. So it's very different from the first one, which is mostly pencil and ink and sort of scratching things. Very interesting project. He still does things. He has very contemporary things that he's been producing. I don't know what his latest one is, but he has some like Donald Trump related ones and Brexit related ones, so you can definitely see him still at work. Now to 2 graphic works that I adored, but I checked out of the library, so I don't have here. However, one of them I will definitely buy whenever I have the chance. The first one is Blankets by Craig Thompson, and this is one of the OG graphic memoirs. I didn't expect to find it so affecting, but I did. So the novel is basically about two relationships, the artist's and protagonist's relationship to his brother, his younger brother, with whom he was forced to share a bed as a kid until they complained so much they finally gave them separate beds, but then for a long time they still found excuses to share the bed. And he charts how they became estranged and then they sort of reconnected again, and also his relationship with a young girl. They both meet in what I assume is Bible camp. Craig Thompson's family is Christian. I don't know if a particular brand of Christianity, but they are very, very Christian. And so they send him to this camp. And there he meets this girl and they have a friendship that veers into romance. It's very one note, the whole thing. It's a coming of age story, but it doesn't follow that arc of self-discovery. It's not a Bildungsroman in a true or conventional sense. It's more of a, this was my childhood, this was this moment, and this is me after going back home. And it's so interesting the way some aspects of it are so detailed and then some other details are sort of closed over. So for example, when the narrative is drawing to a close and he severs some ties, I just don't want to spoil it. It is a memoir, but he's not a celebrity or anything, so it would still come, I don't think, as a shock, because it was a very logical conclusion, as things often are in real life. I won't spoil it, but when he does those things, it's very straightforward the way they are told. They don't dwell, and it's sort of a fade to black, some years have passed sort of thing. In contrast to that, there are moments that are so simple and yet are given so many pages because their emotional resonance for the artist is so big that it feels like they need to be there. Another element is that the art is very beautiful. It's very idiosyncratic. It pays homage, I would say, to traditional cartoons, you know, the very simple lines, but then it plays with that with some sharp angles. And of course, there is the whole element of how it deals with faith. He even considers going into ministry. So it's really impactful and it just worked for me. I feel like a lot of people won't gel with this because it is such a coming of age story and it is very like one note in many ways. If it was a song, it would be, do you know the Arcade Fire soundtrack to the movie Hair? Chill and with very little sort of spikes of sound. It's kind of like that, but I mean it in the best ways. So I really enjoyed it. I would reread it, but actually even just thinking about it makes me a little sad. When I finish, even though it's not a tragic story at all, it's very, yeah, it's good. It's good. I really, really liked it. And then right after this, or no, actually before, I think, I found this one that I had actually seen at a graphic novel store that I love, but I hadn't bought it because I'd already bought too many things, which is the story of my life. Just went for it, read it in one sitting, was profoundly affected, and I really want to buy it. And that is Here by, I want to say Robert McGuire, but it could be Richard McGuire. Let's say Art McGuire. Now, let me fact check that. I have my tablet right here. Richard McGuire. So basically it starts with a room and it offers, it's so hard to explain without showing you. So I will insert like one example because you can Google it and find examples. So I will insert that. But it basically charts in a non-chronological way the history of this place. It's just magnificent because it goes into prehistoric times and also goes into speculative futures. Of course, there are some decades where you know it's the same family, so you kind of get the story of this family and you also get the story of these settlers, some of whom were before the house existed, lived in a home near the spot of where the main house of the story is, so you kind of see how the house is behind and the way the scenes are set up around moments. And so there are, for example, spreads that are all about dancing or fighting or family or time passing. It's just so beautiful. It works that way because it's a graphic novel and the art is beautiful and the setup is so thoughtful and enriches the point of the book. And of course it's called Here because it's the exploration of here through time. I highly recommend it. The next book is not a graphic novel at all, but it's also very unusual. It's The Unfortunates by B.S. Johnson with an introduction by Jonathan Coe. I had never heard of B.S. Johnson before coming to I was going to say Britlands, I don't know why, to England and this master's, so I'm sorry, but I've gathered that he was a very big deal, that he was part of the experimental movement of the 60s, of which I only knew Anne Quinn, and I only knew her because she was recommended by a bookseller at Mr. B's Emporium of Reading the Lights. I wouldn't have known otherwise, so now I've learned, and I definitely want to read more. But yeah, this is a box, and when it opens, tan tan tan. So here it has a note that says, this novel has 27 sections temporarily held together by a removable wrapper. Apart from the first and last sections, which are marked as such, the other 25 sections are intended to be read in random order. If readers prefer not to accept the random order in which they receive the novel, then they may rearrange the sections into any other random order before reading. And it has the epigraphs here and here. These are the booklets, including the introduction. The introduction is also a booklet, very fascinating in form. And you may be thinking, oh, what a gimmick. But actually, the form, it's very relevant to the content. It is autofiction, by the way, also. It is a bit anachronistic to say so, because I don't think that term was in use in the 60s. Well, I don't know if this was published in the 60s, but oh, it is one of the lost classics of the 1960s. There you go. Basically, B.S. Johnson went to this stadium to cover a football match. And this is a fake report that would be in the fiction of the text, the report that the B.S. Johnson stand-in produced. So that is interesting. He's walking throughout the stadium. He's thinking about his friend who has passed away from cancer and reminiscing. The reason these can be read in any order is because he wants to emulate the way memory works and sort of the aleatory nature of memory. And I gotta admit, I was a bit skeptical at first, but I found it actually worked really, really well. It is a very moving portrait of this friendship. The writing itself is just very, very beautiful. And so I cannot wait to reread this more attentively. I really recommend it. I mean, it is like a hard book to get a hold of, but I think even if you were to read this in a more traditional way, it would still be fun and like nice to read and very affecting and moving, especially because, like the meandering of the walking, the disease itself is not addressed, and it is a very oblique way of approaching the text and the passing and the grief. So it does work even better with the randomness of it. And every time you revisit it, unless you read it in the same order every single time, which would be so boring if you did. I mean, not the book would still be good, but like you would be a boring person for doing that, I think. It will still like give you those flashes and moments. I thought it was really successful. It comes in this cute little box, and I had to get it from Blackwell's, but no regrets. It is £20, so not the cheapest, but come on, it's worth it, and I will revisit it many, many times. And finally, I got an excuse to reread two of my favorite things of the entire world, and I'll just... For my queer writing seminars, we had to read Fun Home, a family tragicomic, and Are You My Mother, a comic drama by Allison Bechdel. It was such a great day. It was actually the last seminar that I had in my entire MA, I guess, because I'm not having any more that are part of the MA. So there you go. Last class. It was amazing. I've read these several times and I will read them several more. Well, let me explain in case you have never heard me talk about these. These are graphic memoirs. Alison Bechdel rose to prominence with a comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For, which I want to have the essential collection of. She fictionalized a lot of her life experiences, but it was basically about living as a lesbian in the 21st century, basically. And in one of those strips, go to the films, and one of them complains that there was no scene of two women talking to each other, and voila, the Bechdel test was born. Of course, that was taken by another critic as a starting point. It's not that Alison Bechdel came up with the test as a concept, but it's named after her and after that comment. And anyways, Fun Home was her debut memoir, and it deals with her relationship to her father and his sexuality and her own sexuality. Her father was attracted to men, but more specifically had illicit affairs with young teens, which is not great and caused him a great deal of scandal, although he never went to prison for it. So Bechdel just talks about her relationship with her dad, but she does so in a way that is fascinating. It's called Fun Home because they owned a funeral home and they called it Fun Home, which is all the more relevant because her dad died ran over by a bus, and the question has always remained whether he killed himself because he had been outed and he was in the middle of this scandal and he couldn't deal anymore with his sexuality, or if it was just an accident. And they will never be able to know. So can you imagine that feeling and writing a memoir about it? Bechdel was also a very particular obsessive child, and so she delves into her own compulsions and she talks about discovering her sexuality and how she processed everything. The way that she goes to literature and books in order to understand her relationship with her father, her own sexuality, just as a means to process and as a means to gather a framework through which to view her life, I just found completely 100% relatable. Her art style is amazing. I really like the palette. I just really highly recommend it. And then Are You My Mother is the sequel. I'm sorry for the reflection, but the mirror is a very important element. Instead of delving so much into literature, this one takes psychoanalyst Winnicott's theories of object relations and attachments in order to explain her relation to therapy, her relation to relationships, and to her mom. And so this book has such an interesting temporality because a lot of it takes place while she's writing her first book about her dad, so Fun Home, and it starts there, but it also of course talks about writing this book itself. It has sort of a complementary palette, again very effectively used. The way objects and photographies are depicted in both books, actually, it's just so clever, so precise. What I will say is that this I like more. This one is closer to my heart. It affects me more deeply. It's just more personal for me. But this one I think is a masterpiece and it's perfectly done. So I do recommend both, but I think this one feels a bit more tortured. Clearly she was struggling much more with it and she had to redo it actually because it had no direction. And I think even though she got it out and it's a great book, you can tell that it's a bit denser, a bit heavier, but it is so good. And as I said, both of these are framed by sort of literary explorations. This one by a lot of Ulysses because Alison Bechdel had to take a class on it, but also her father really liked it. And this one is more grounded in psychoanalytic theory and it delves into her dreams and everything. I love Alison Bechdel so much. I promise next time that I read her, which will be soon probably, I won't go into so much detail about these memoirs because it's kind of like less, isn't it? I will reread these books and I will mention that I've reread them, but I cannot keep gushing about them and describing them. So there you go. That was my March wrap-up part 1. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, please give a thumbs up, please subscribe and comment. Have you read any of these books? Do you want to read any of these books after hearing me talk about them? What did you read in March that you loved or hated? And what are you reading now? Because I always want to know that. And that's all. See you next time.